is easy. Anyone can play a blues solo, it's just repetitive minor pentatonic licks with boomer bends and vibrato. Anyone can do it. You've no doubt heard these unsavory takes on blues guitar playing, rolled your eyes at the ignorance and laughed. Why? Because you and I both know that improvising at the level of modern blues guitar greats such as Robin Ford, Matt Schofield and Josh Smith is anything but easy. However, if you're like me, you might have spent years struggling to find the answer to the question of why? Why is it so hard to improvise blues solos that highlight the chord changes perfectly and land on the right notes at the right time, just like those guys seem to do effortlessly? Why is it that I can only sound good over the 1 chord, but I always seem to trip up over the 4 and 5 chords? What is it that's causing that clash between my note choices and those chords? How do I move beyond the minor pentatonic and blues scales to incorporate soloing approaches that sound more sophisticated and tasteful? I spent years asking myself these questions before I found the answers, and if you found this masterclass, then I'm happy to inform you that you're already a step ahead of so many other guitar players who are stuck in the all too common blues guitar rut of only approaching it with 1 scale, the minor pentatonic or the blues scale. In this blues guitar masterclass, I'm going to be outlining a few soloing concepts that you can start using right away that will have you feeling excited again about the progression of your skills as a blues improviser. Don't get me wrong, you are not going to start playing like Robin Ford overnight, but you will be a step closer to playing like the new and improved 2.0 version of yourself. And if your blues guitar playing hasn't improved for years, then taking just 1 step forward today and maybe another the day after compound into massive improvements in as little as a few weeks' time. So if you're new to my content, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ross Campbell. I run a guitar education platform called Bulletproof Guitar Player, and today I want to share with you a few of my favorite concepts outlined in the chapters of my new book, Beyond Pentatonics for Blues Guitar, published by Guitar Vivo. As the title suggests, this book is perfect for the type of guitarist who loves playing blues but feels as though they've been stuck in a never-ending minor pentatonic rut. I know your time is valuable to you, so allow me to get right into it. I want to kick things off by playing you an unaccompanied blues shuffle in the key of A. So there were no chords or bass lines implying the underlying harmony there. Harmony in this context meaning the 12-bar blues chord progression that I'm hearing in my head as I play. And despite the absence of any actual chords being played, your ears may well have picked up on the chord changes through my note choices alone. I was very deliberate with my note choices in that etude that I just played because I was actively trying to highlight them throughout, meaning the chord changes. I'm trying to highlight the chord changes with my note choices alone when I'm playing things like that. So if you can get to a level at which you can improvise a 12-bar blues progression alone, unaccompanied, and play a solo that implies the chord changes to the listener without strumming any actual chords, chances are you're going to put yourself above 99% of blues guitarists in the world. Because let's face it, a lot of guitar players love to play blues, but very few can sound good on their own without a band backing them up, without that safety net. And if you can play solos that sound amazing unaccompanied, just imagine how good you could sound playing in the context of a band. Before we can talk about licks, before we can look at, for example, making the transition from the 1 to the 4 chord, playing through the turnaround using this arpeggio and that scale, we need to address the root cause of stagnation that so many blues guitar players face, that being the 12-bar blues progression itself. Allow me to play through one 12-bar round of a blues progression in A. What I just played there was your basic 12-bar blues progression, which is made up of 3 chords. These are called 1, 4, and 5 chords. In the key of A, the 1 chord is A7, the 4 chord is D7, and the 5 chord is called E7. That is 3 dominant 7th chords, all with different root notes in the same chord progression. Now, from a rhythm playing perspective, that's relatively easy to play. You don't really have to think much or have insane technical ability to be able to play the actual chords as a rhythm player. However, improvising over a chord progression that has 3 dominant 7th chords with different root notes is another story altogether. Why? Well, there is no one scale fits all approach to doing this. At least not to the same degree of sophistication that you hear from the likes of, say, Robin Ford, Matt Schofield, or Josh Smith. Trust me, the blues scale is off the table when it comes to this, and I elaborate on that in one of the chapters in the book. This is not like playing over a major chord progression, which would be diatonic. So what's a diatonic progression? A diatonic progression is one consisting of chords that are all built from the naturally occurring notes in a particular scale. For example, if I was to play a 12-bar blues in A, but this time using the chords that are naturally built from the notes of the A major scale, it would sound like this. It doesn't exactly sound like blues, does it? That's because the 1 and 4 chords built from the A major scale would be major 7th chords, so A major 7 and D major 7. And only the 5 chord would naturally be a dominant 7. So the 5 chord is actually the only naturally occurring dominant 7th chord found in the major scale. That's noticeably different to an actual blues progression, which, as demonstrated earlier, has you playing all 3 chords, the 1, 4, and 5, as dominant 7th chords. Ross, what scale are you playing? This is the question I'm often asked in the comments section whenever I post a blues improvisation clip online, and the answer is never the minor pentatonic or the major pentatonic, or mixolydian. I'll tell you now that there is no scale that exists that has 3 naturally occurring dominant 7th chords built from the 1st, 4th, and 5th scale degrees. Not the major scale, not mixolydian, not any scale. Unless you want to be pedantic and say the chromatic scale, since it contains all 12 notes, but that's not helping anyone. So where do these chords come from? The answer, honestly, I don't know. Blues music, for whatever reason, it evolved into a basic 12-bar progression where all 3 of the chords, the 1, 4, and 5, are either played or treated as dominant 7th chords. Now this presents us with a puzzle to solve. If the chords don't all originate from one scale, how do we improvise over them? Well, the answer is you need to look beyond simply using scale-based soloing approaches and start treating each chord independently. In the book, I focus on a number of soloing approaches that include scales but also look beyond them. So scales, arpeggios, chromatic enclosures, chord voicings, passing notes. These are all fantastic tools that we can use to solve the puzzle of blues improvisation, but what you need to understand about them fundamentally is that their primary function in the context of blues improvisation is to allow you to target the chord tones of the 1, 4, and 5 chords. This is how your favorite blues players imply the chord changes in their solos without playing a single chord. What do I mean by chord tones? Well, your basic dominant 7th chord contains 4 chord tones. It has a root note, a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a flat 7th. You may or may not know what I mean by major 3rd, perfect 5th, and flat 7th, and if you don't, that's okay, you can keep watching. It's also worth mentioning that in the book we have a theory primer chapter, which will get you up to speed on the aforementioned lingo. Each of the 3 chords in a blues in the key of A, A7, D7, and E7, as we know, are the same chord type. They are all dominant 7th chords. So although they contain different notes, they all have the same structure, the same chord tones, a root, a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a flat 7th. I'll demonstrate this with arpeggios rather than chord voicings because it's going to be easier for you to see. So here's the chord tones of an A7 chord. If we look at an A7 bar chord, I'm strumming 6 strings there, but I'm really only playing 4 notes. So allow me to rearrange them, as I said, in an arpeggio shape, which is going to be easier for you to visualize. So we've got the root note, major 3rd, perfect 5th, and flat 7th. Now let's do the same for the 4 chord. D7, root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, flat 7th. And the 5 chord, E7, root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, flat 7th. So, as you will find out very soon, chord tones are the name of the game when it comes to tasteful blues improvisation. These are the notes you want to target, especially when making the transition between the chords. When you look at the notes in the minor pentatonic and blues scales and see what they have in common with the chord tones of the 1, 4, and 5 chords, it should become clear to you that using the minor pentatonic or blues scale alone for a full solo is an approach that has likely failed you as an aspiring blues guitarist for years. Side note, from this point onwards, if you hear me say minor pentatonic scale, know that I specifically mean the minor pentatonic built from the root of the 1 chord. So in the key of A, that's A minor pentatonic. I don't want you to make the mistake of thinking that I'm talking about A minor pentatonic for the 1 chord and then D minor pentatonic for the 4 chord and E minor pentatonic for the 5 chord. That's not what we're doing here. If, for example, you take the notes of the A minor pentatonic scale and put them side by side with the chord tones of the 1, 4, and 5 chords in A, there will be commonalities, but you'll also realize that the scale lacks one very important chord tone for not only the 1 chord, but the 4 and 5 chords as well. What do I mean by this? Well, the minor pentatonic contains a root, flat 3rd, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, and flat 7th, which are the notes A, C, D, E, G. If we look at those 5 notes against the chord tones of the 1 chord A7, we can see that the minor pentatonic includes the root, 5th, and flat 7th from that A7 chord. Look at those same notes from the minor pentatonic against the chord tones of the 4 chord D7, and you'll see that the minor pentatonic features the root, 5th, and flat 7th of that chord as well. And looking at the notes of the scale against the chord tones of the 5 chord, you'll notice that what the A minor pentatonic has in common with an E7 chord are 2 of its chord tones, the root and the flat 7th. So, the minor pentatonic has 3 notes in common with the chord tones of the 1 chord, 3 notes in common with the chord tones of the 4 chord, and 2 notes in common with the chord tones of the 5 chord. On paper, that sounds like a lot, right? Well, I said earlier that although these commonalities exist between the minor pentatonic and the 3 dominant 7th chords in a 12-bar blues, the scale lacks one very important chord tone from each of the 3 chords. It doesn't contain the major third of the 1 chord. It doesn't contain the major third of the 4 chord, and it doesn't contain the major third of the 5 chord. In my opinion, of the 4 chord tones in a dominant 7th chord, the root, major third, perfect 5th, and flat 7th, the root and the major third are the 2 strongest ones to land on, especially when making the transition between the chords. For example, here is a lick played over the turnaround that targets the major third of the 5, 4, and 1 chords in that order. This is the major third of the 5 chord E7. This is the major third of the 4 chord D7. And this is the major third of the 1 chord A7. And hopefully you can hear that I'm targeting these chord tones in that lick. The minor pentatonic doesn't contain any of those major thirds for the chords. So, if your approach to blues improvisation up until this point has solely been based on the minor pentatonic or even the blues scale, which is much the same, then it's no wonder that you feel you aren't able to highlight the chord changes very well, because this minor pentatonic approach leaves that money note, the major third, on the table for all 3 chords. It's not that the minor pentatonic is useless in a blues context, but clearly if we want to exploit that major third in all 3 of the chords, we need to look beyond a strictly minor pentatonic approach. At the start of this masterclass, you heard me play an improvised solo that went around the 12-bar blues progression several times in a row. And if you wish to study that solo yourself, I've made the tab and notation file available as a free download. I'm not going to break down that solo specifically in the masterclass, but what I am going to break down is a short 12-bar solo that will introduce you to my way of thinking when it comes to navigating the fretboard during a blues solo. Much of this solo example is played in the same area where you will find position 1 of the minor pentatonic, so that you can relate my analysis of each part to a very familiar portion of the fretboard. We'll approach it in several sections. In this first one, we'll be analysing my note choices over the 1 chord. So here's the solo in full. By the way, you can download this same backing track at 3 different tempos if you wish to learn this solo and practice it yourself at home at a tempo you can manage. The book comes with 72 versions of the same shuffle backing track, giving you a variety of keys, tempos, and band arrangements to play along with. In many of the chapters, I refer to something I like to call the 1 chord note palette. This is essentially a combination of the major pentatonic, the minor pentatonic, the blues scale, and mixolydian. Let's start by taking a look at each of those scales individually. The scale formula for the minor pentatonic is as follows: root, flat third, fourth, fifth, flat seventh. Now the blues scale. It's almost the same as the minor pentatonic, only you add a note between the fourth and fifth called a flat five. So the scale formula is root, flat third, fourth, flat five, perfect fifth, flat seventh. The major pentatonic is root, major second, major third, perfect fifth, major sixth. And Mixolydian is root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, flat seventh. Now, I want you to pay attention to what happens when you take the scale formulas for the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic and combine them. The resulting formula is root, major second, flat third, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and flat seventh. Let's put that side by side with the scale formula for Mixolydian, which, as we just learned, is root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, and flat seventh. Looking on screen, can you see how similar they are? The combined pentatonic scales are essentially the same as the Mixolydian mode, only with the addition of a flat third, which is coming from the minor pentatonic. And if we throw the blues scale into that mix as well, you're really just adding one more note, that being a flat five, since all of the other notes in the blues scale make up the minor pentatonic anyway. So all in all, the formula for our one chord note palette is as follows: root, major second, flat third, major third, perfect fourth, flat five, perfect fifth, major sixth, flat seventh. That's 9 note choices that we have for the one chord alone. But simply knowing that you have these note choices available to you doesn't exactly help much when it comes to understanding how to make music with them. Let me make it abundantly clear that I never practiced this one chord note palette as a movable set of scale patterns, or even thought of it as one complete scale, and I wouldn't advise you to try to do so yourself. What I would advise you to do is study blues improvisation vocabulary that is played over the one chord. How do you do that? Well, one way is to study the solos of your blues influences and work out what they do. But if you're not adept at learning things by ear just yet, that could be difficult. So in my book, I provide a wealth of lick and phrasing examples for all parts of the 12-bar blues progression, with tab and notation, and a detailed analysis on many of them, which includes fretboard diagrams, so that you can actually see how I'm visualizing these notes that are beyond the minor pentatonic. Gradually, through practicing the vocabulary in the book and paying attention to the analysis of each example, not only will you equip yourself with a bunch of new phrasing ideas, you'll improve your fretboard visualization as you start to map out note choices that you wouldn't normally consider going for if you're only used to visualizing minor pentatonic scale positions and nothing else. For example, if you're visualizing position 1 of the minor pentatonic, and you start practicing the examples in the book, over time you're going to begin to notice where, for example, major sixths can be found in relation to that position, or where major thirds are. So now I'm going to give you a taste of that by breaking down each part of that 12-bar solo that I demonstrated at the start of this section. Let's break off the first chunk of it and analyze the notes played over the one chord. We'll start by listening to that part once again in isolation, first to the original tempo and then slowed down. I would advise that if you haven't done so already, you download the PDF tab sheet for this solo so that you can follow along with me as I break it down. The first note choice that I want to talk about is one that goes beyond the minor pentatonic, and it's this use of the major third. This is the type of third you have in a dominant seventh chord. Remember when I showed you those dominant seventh arpeggios? This note here, root, third, that's a major third. So that's the type of third we've got in the dominant seventh chord. And as I've already expressed, root notes and major thirds, generally speaking, are my favorite chord tones to target. It appears in a few places in this first chunk of the solo. So we've got it right at the start there. Again here. Now, what you may have noticed is that every time I play that major third, it is preceded by a note that's 1 fret below it. Okay, this is the major third, and 1 fret below it, I've got this. This note is a different kind of third. It's called a flat third, and it's not found naturally in the dominant seventh chord, but it is part of the minor pentatonic and the blues scale. And what you'll find that a lot of blues guitarists do, in fact, all of them really, is they use that flat third as a passing note when targeting the major third. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. My target note is the major third. That's the note that I want to lean on because it's in the chord that I'm playing over, but simply playing it on its own can sound a bit boring. So instead of doing that, I'll make the effort to precede it with the flat third, and so it makes sense to think of that flat third as a passing note. So passing notes are a common theme throughout the vocabulary in the book for all 3 of the chords. Now, I'm aware that I've perhaps gone overboard in expressing my disdain for using the minor pentatonic for an entire blues solo, and I've maybe risked misleading you into thinking that you should abandon it entirely, and you shouldn't. It absolutely still has its uses, and this should illustrate that to you. That flat third from the minor pentatonic is gold when it's used as a passing note to target the third that is in the dominant seventh chord, that being, say it with me, the major third. Next, let's look at how I've used major sixths in this same chunk of the solo. So the major sixth is played in a couple of different places. Here on the B string, and down here an octave lower on the D string. The major sixth, although it's not found in a basic dominant seventh chord, I think you'll agree sounds really nice when played over it. It is, however, often used as a natural extension of a dominant seventh chord, for example, in a dominant 13th voicing like this. And lastly, before we move on to the next part of the solo, there is one more note choice that I've used here that isn't in the minor pentatonic, that being a natural second, also known as a ninth. Here's the part of the lick where I play it. It's the note at fret 4 on the G string, so it's just a semitone below the flat third from the minor pentatonic. Like the sixth, the natural second is not a note that is found naturally in a dominant seventh chord, but it sounds good over it, and it can also be used as a natural extension of a dominant 7th chord, for example, in this dominant 9th voicing. So note B, that's the natural second of A. I never considered using this note in my blues licks until I began studying the playing of Matt Schofield. You'll find that he uses this note quite often in his phrases in this same area of the fretboard where position 1 of the minor pentatonic is found. We're almost at the end of this section on what I played over the 1 chord, and I've just realized I have been playing the very end of it a little bit differently to how I did in the original recording. So I think in the original recording it was this. But I've been going. So the actual ending is this. Okay, so I'm gonna try and do my best for the rest of this masterclass to actually play what I played in the solo, so apologies for that. So in this first chunk of the solo, I've demonstrated to you where you can find many of these note choices from the 1 chord note palette in relation to the minor pentatonic scale positions that you already know. Major thirds, major sixths, and major seconds. Next, we're going to look at the first part of the 12-bar blues progression that tends to trip up a lot of players, that being the first chord change. In this section, I'll outline my approach to the first chord change in a 12-bar blues progression, that being the move from the 1 chord to the 4 chord in bar 5. I'll also address what to play once you're on the 4 chord and how to come back to the 1 chord after those 2 bars. Just to remind you, be sure to download the free tab file for the solo if you haven't already. Now, before I break anything down, it's important to discuss 2 things first. 1, the place in the chord progression where this chord change occurs and how long it lasts for. We need to be on the same page regarding that. And 2, the switch in visualization that I have to make when playing through this chord change in my solo. So let's start with where the chord change occurs in the progression. So if you look on screen, I've added a graphic of the 12-bar blues chord progression in A that represents what's going on harmonically in the backing track. And just FYI, the symbol that looks like a little percentage symbol that's in a few of the bars there, that just means a continuation of the same chord. For example, in bar 1, it's stated that A7 is the chord being played, and it's also played in bars 2, 3, and 4, and this is just represented by that symbol. So if you see that on a chord chart, know that that's what that means. Just continue playing the same chord type, basically. So this 12-bar blues progression in A, it starts with 4 bars of the 1 chord A7. Then it moves to the 4 chord D7 in bar 5, and as you can see, you stay on that 4 chord for 2 full bars, and then in bar 7, you go back to the 1 chord. So that's what's going on structurally. Now I want to discuss the change that I have to make mentally when moving from the 1 to the 4 chord. This is getting deeper into the idea of moving beyond scales that I hinted at earlier on. In the previous section that covered the part played over the 1 chord, I basically said, this is the palette of note choices that I like to choose from over the 1 chord, and here's how they relate to the minor pentatonic scale. Although the 4 chord D7 is the same chord type, meaning it's also a dominant 7th, I don't exactly use the same approach used for the 1 chord when I make the switch from 1 to 4, meaning I don't necessarily have a 4 chord note palette in mind where I have all of these note choices that I can relate to D minor pentatonic scale positions. When I move to the 4 chord, I don't really think about scales, at least not in the way that you might assume. As you'll see when I come to break down example 3 in particular, I'm still very much aware of the A minor pentatonic positions, but the improvisational tools I'm more inclined to use when I first get to that new chord are things like arpeggios, triads, and chromatic enclosures, all of which are of course demonstrated in great detail in the book. And when I'm making the transition between the 1 and 4 chords, if I want to play a cohesive line that connects the 2 chords, my intention phrasing wise, or my goal, is to begin my lick over the one chord, drawing from that one chord note palette described in the earlier section, and end it in a way that lands me on the root or the major third of the 4 chord pretty much as soon as it arrives. Once I've reached bar 5 and I'm now on that 4 chord for 2 full bars, all of the notes that I play, I'm pretty much now relating to the root note of that 4 chord, meaning if I'm on the D7 chord, I'm now visualizing everything in relation to D root notes all across the fretboard rather than A root notes, since A7 was the chord I was playing over previously. In the introduction to this masterclass, I'm sure I would have said something to the effect of, you need to move beyond a purely scale-based approach and start treating each chord independently. And so visualizing the root notes for each of the 1, 4, and 5 chords as and when they appear is of course a fundamental part of looking at blues improvisation in this new way that, if you're still watching this, I'm assuming is new to you. And by the way, let me just state that I'm aware I'm throwing a lot of new information at you in this masterclass. So if you feel like you aren't quite getting it, that is to be expected. If I was teaching you privately and you were able to show that you instantly understood everything and how to apply it, I would honestly feel a little bit freaked out. Anyway, let's take a closer look at what I played over this part of the progression. We'll start with the lick that takes us from the 1 to the 4 chord. So this starts just before bar 4 and takes us through to the start of bar 5, which means we've got just over 1 full bar where we're playing over the 1 chord. And then the ending has us targeting chord tones for the 4 chord, right as that chord change appears. This is what I play over the 1 chord. You might recognize that use of the flat third passing note to target the major third of the 1 chord in a couple of places there. Now it's important to note that at this point I am still visualizing A root notes, since all of this is still played over the 1 chord A7. We haven't made the switch to the 4 chord just yet. However, that's about to change when I play the final 2 notes of this lick. So what are those 2 notes? Well, the first is F sharp, which is the major third of the 4 chord D7. And the last one is D, the root of the 4 chord. I've mentioned already that when it comes to highlighting the changes through targeting the chord tones, I'm a big fan of landing on roots and or major thirds right when the chords change. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. Okay, so now that I'm on those 2 bars of the 4 chord, what do I play to tide me over and take me back to the 1 chord? Let's listen back to what I played in the solo. Let's break that into even smaller chunks, starting with this. Now, if I'm not visualizing a scale here, what am I visualizing instead? Well, take a look at this. That, what I just played, is a D dominant 7th arpeggio shape that contains all 4 of the chord tones: the root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, and flat 7th. Dominant 7th arpeggios are a fantastic tool to use for blues improvisation, And the cool thing is that because all three of the chords are the same chord type, the arpeggio shapes that you'll learn in the book for, say, the 4 chord are the same shapes that you can apply to the 1 and 5 chords too. You just, of course, have to know where the root notes are so that you can move them to the relevant areas of the fretboard. Anyway, simply memorizing arpeggio shapes is only half of the battle. The other is incorporating them into a lick in a way that sounds musical and not like an arpeggio exercise. Because imagine we're in a private lesson together and I say to you, here's a dominant 7th arpeggio shape. Play it for me. You would only spend a few seconds figuring out where to place your fingers, but you'd pick it up fairly quick. And if I then said to you, all right, I'm going to put the backing track on, I want you to make some music with that, play a lick with it over the 4 chord, you might just tentatively move around the notes and try to be somewhat rhythmically conscious when doing so. We've all been there when learning and memorizing the positions of, say, a new scale. We get excited to go and play it over a backing track, but instead of playing the melodic, tasteful, inspiring solos that we hear in our heads, what comes out instead sounds like, well, scale position practice over a backing track. So unless I showed you otherwise, you may not have realized that there's no rule saying that you have to only play the 4 notes in the arpeggio and nothing else. So what did I do with this arpeggio shape to make it sound more musical? Well, I start on the root note, and the next chord tone up from there would be the major third, this note on the B string. Okay, root, major third. But rather than simply playing the root followed by the major third, I go root, flat third, major third. Now, does that ring a bell? It's the same passing note approach that I applied to the major third of the 1 chord. Remember this? Okay, that was flat third to major third of the 1 chord. I'm doing the same thing here, but using the flat and major third of the 4 chord. Now, whilst I'm not necessarily visualizing D minor pentatonic scale positions when I get to the 4 chord, the flat third is only a semitone lower than the major third. So it's easy enough to visualize, provided you know where D root notes and major thirds are. And if you don't have that fundamental fretboard visualization in place already, that's absolutely something you can learn and master with the right guidance, but it's beyond the scope of what we're covering in this masterclass. I do teach it in the first Bulletproof Guitar Player course if you are curious. Anyway, after the flat third to major third, I then pick the perfect 5th in the D7 arpeggio, and then I slide into the flat 7th. Okay, this is the perfect 5th, and this is the flat 7th. Then I pick that major third again, followed by the major 6th of D. Then the major third again. And after that, I play a sequence of notes from the A minor pentatonic scale. We're still on the 4 chord, but the return to the 1 chord is just around the corner. So I actually make the switch back to visualizing root notes for the 1 chord at this point in the lick. Continuing that A minor pentatonic sequence through to the end of this example, I play this. So there we've got some notes from our 1 chord note palette, the natural 2nd at fret 4 on the G string, and the major 6th at fret 4 on the D string, and of course the major 3rd from the 1 chord at fret 6. So to summarise, when making the transition from the 1 chord to the 4, I started the lick by targeting the major third of the 1 chord and then targeted the major third and root note of the 4 chord as soon as it arrived. And once on the 4 chord, I played a phrase based around this D7 arpeggio shape. Before returning to the 1 chord with a descending minor pentatonic string of notes, as well as some of the other notes from the 1 chord note palette. We've got one more part of the 12-bar blues progression to cover in this masterclass, that being the turnaround. In this final section, we'll be tackling what is typically the most challenging part of the 12-bar blues progression to improvise over. Why is it the most challenging? Because you're having to play over all 3 of the chords in quick succession. The part of the progression that I'm referring to is known as the turnaround. It's called that because it's the final 4 bars, and once you get to the end of them, you turn around and go back to the start of the 12-bar progression and repeat it all over again. If you look on screen now, you'll see these 4 bars highlighted, and they consist of 1 bar of the 5 chord, 1 bar of the 4 chord, and 2 bars of the 1 chord. We've already encountered the 1 and 4 chords, and I've given you a glimpse into how I generally like to approach improvising over these chords. Over the 1 chord, it's the 1 chord note palette, which consists of notes from several scales all pulled together, although it's worth mentioning that arpeggios, triads, etc. are also structures that I like to visualize over this same chord. But a lot of what I'm seeing is related to the positions of the minor pentatonic scale, and I'm just aware of where notes like major thirds, major sixths, seconds, etc. are located in relation to the minor pentatonic positions. In the previous section, I showed you that over the 4 chord, it's less of a scale-based approach and more centered around, let's say, more streamlined melodic structures, meaning things that contain fewer notes than scales, like, for example, dominant 7th arpeggios, which just contain 4 notes. The turnaround is the only place in the progression where the 5 chord appears, and so we have not yet encountered this chord in the masterclass. Now, although this is a new chord that we have to play over, remember that all of the 3 chords, the 1, the 4, and the 5, are all the same chord type. They are all dominant 7th chords, which means that a lot of the same vocabulary and soloing approaches used over the 1 and 4 chords can just as easily be applied to the 5 chord. Also, this chord is only appearing for 1 out of the 12 bars that make up the entire progression, so you really don't have to play over it for very long at all. For a blues in the key of A, our 5 chord is E7. Now, for the 4 chord, since we're playing over it for 2 full bars, the approach when compared to the 1 chord was a lot less scale-based, and as I said not too long ago, was more focused on streamlined melodic structures like the dominant 7th arpeggios, amongst other tools that I talk about in the book, like chromatic enclosures and triads. This is also how I approach the 5 chord. I very rarely, if ever, think in terms of scales when improvising over it. It's almost always a dominant 7th arpeggio or a triad or a chromatic enclosure that I'll use to target the chord tones of the 5 chord in my solos. So we're about to listen back to what I played over the turnaround in the solo and analyze it. Before we do though, it's important to note that this lick example starts in the bar before the actual turnaround. So look again at the chord progression on screen and you'll see that the turnaround itself is bars 9 through 12. This lick example is going to start in bar 8 when you're still on the 1 chord before the 5 comes. So I'm going to play something that starts out over the 1 chord in bar 8, then connects to and leads me into the 5 chord in bar 9. Then in bar 10, we move to the 4 chord, and for the final 2 bars, we are back to the 1 chord. Learning this part of the solo is going to give you a sense of what it can feel like to be able to play one cohesive line that creatively ties together all 3 of the chords in a standard 12-bar blues progression. That's enough talking for now. Let's listen back to what I played. Let's start with what I play in bar 8 whilst I'm on the 1 chord and preparing to move into the 5. As you can see and hear, I'm targeting that major third of the 1 chord by using our trusty old flat third passing note, which is courtesy of the A minor pentatonic. Then, as we're nearing bar 9, I introduce a note which you could view as the major 6th of the 1 chord. Followed by a note that's a fret higher. Well, actually that's punctuated by the 5th, so we've got this note that's a fret higher than the major 6th of the 1 chord. You could view that as the flat 7th of the 1 chord. Now, why am I saying that you could view these 2 notes as the 6th and flat 7th of the 1 chord? Because if I'm saying that you could view them as such, then that implies that they could be viewed in relation to something else. Well, although technically we're still on the 1 chord at this point, I'm looking at these 2 notes in relation to the 5 chord, E7, which is coming up in the next bar. So listen to me play from bar 8 into bar 9 once again. In bar 9, I'm highlighting the 5 chord by playing a sequence of notes that's based around an E major triad shape. Now, a major triad contains 3 notes, a root, major third, and perfect 5th, all of which we have here in this particular inversion. Here's the root note, the major third, and the perfect 5th. Within any dominant 7th arpeggio, you will find a major triad. So it makes sense that you can use both major triads and dominant 7th arpeggios to play over dominant 7th chords. The major triad, of course, doesn't have the flat 7th, but that's okay. You don't have to play through all of the chord tones every time. You could play 3, 2, or even just 1. There are no rules. Anyway, the first note that I play in this E major triad is its major third. So going back to those 2 notes at the end of bar 8, these in particular, which I said you could view as the major 6th and flat 7th of the 1 chord, I am actually viewing these notes as 2 passing notes to lead me to the note that I'm targeting for the 4 chord, that being its major third right at the start of bar 9, as soon as the 5 chord appears. Can you hear how these 2 notes are leading into this? So I play those passing notes leading me into the major third of the triad, and then I play this. So at the end, I'm just sliding up into an E root note. And something interesting to note about these two notes. This could be viewed as the major second of E. Okay, and this could be viewed as the flat third of E. So again, like we did for the 1 and 4 chords in their major thirds, I'm preceding the major third of the 5 chord with its flat third. That's it for the 5 chord. That bar is pretty much over. The next bar brings back the 4 chord, and I take a very similar approach to highlighting it as I did when it appeared in bars 5 and 6, with a passage of notes built around this D7 arpeggio shape. Again, I'm using the flat third of D as a passing note for the major third. And I'm also getting in the other chord tones, the 5th, the flat 7th, and the major 6th of D as well. In this same bar, before the 1 chord actually appears in the progression again, I begin the process of going back to it with an A minor pentatonic based line that also incorporates the natural second of A at fret 4 on the G string. Moving on to bar 11, I play this. So we're back on the 1 chord now, and I'm visualizing position 1 of the minor pentatonic here. That's the area of the fretboard that we're in. But as you can see in here, I'm pulling in notes from the 1 chord note palette, like the major 6th here and here, as well as the major 3rd. In the final bar, bar 12, we're still on the 1 chord, and I play this slippery little line that has me getting in that flat 5 from the blues scale, which I don't believe I've played up until this point in the solo. Now I really like that little string of 4 notes that you can find on the B string there, the flat 7th, major 6th, perfect 5th, and flat 5th. That's perhaps a way of phrasing the flat 5 that you might not have considered before, since a lot of players tend to only visualize and play it here on the G string, in this position of the scale. So here I'm placing it on the B string instead. And then to finish, I actually just played it there, but I'll play it again. I play this classic movement from the flat 3rd passing note to the major 3rd, getting in that major 6th of the 1 chord on the B string as well, then finishing with the root note here, and then a nice big slide into the same root note, same pitch, but this time at fret 10 on the B string. And that's it. Let me play through the turnaround lick in full once again. Let's listen to the full solo once again at a nice and slow tempo, and then after that you can follow me into the final section where I'll summarize everything you've learned in this masterclass and give you some pointers on where to go next with your blues improvisation practice. Alright, that brings us to the end of the masterclass. Well done for making it to this point. I sincerely hope that this has given you some inspiration to finally break out of the rut that you might have been in with your blues improvisation, whether it's been years or decades long. You don't have to settle for minor pentatonic prison anymore. As useful as the scale is, even in blues, you will have seen from watching this masterclass that there's so much more that you can incorporate to your soloing approach that can be used to highlight the chord changes tastefully. And if you feel overwhelmed by everything that I've thrown at you today, then don't feel bad. Like I said in an earlier section, it would be a bit freaky if you picked this all up instantly. For me, it was several months of transcribing solos before I felt as though the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. So, as with anything that you learn on the guitar, I would encourage you to take it slow. Be okay with the delayed gratification of just going one step at a time. Don't get me wrong, you should set yourself big goals and strive towards them, absolutely do that, but do so in a way where you're only focused on thinking, what is the next tiny step that I can take with the time that I have available to me today? And that might be an hour of improvisation practice, it might be 4 hours, or it might just be 15 minutes of drilling, say, arpeggio exercises. Just do what you can with the time that you have, and you will make progress. Now, I wanted this masterclass to be as informative as possible, but truthfully, the material I've presented you with today is only scratching the surface of what's included in my book, Beyond Pentatonic Blues Guitar, published by Guitar Vivo. The chapters take you through everything you need to know about navigating each part of the progression, what to play over the 1 chord, making the switch to and from the 4 chord, and the turnaround. I go in depth on the 1 chord note palette, arpeggios, triads, passing notes, concepts we didn't even touch on today like chromatic enclosures, and also a couple of things you can do to channel an outside sound, such as using augmented triads or the half-whole diminished scale like Robin Ford does. Everything is demonstrated across 126 playing examples that are tabbed out and notated in full, and you also get video and audio versions of the examples so you can see and hear exactly how I play them myself. And these examples include things like licks, visualization exercises, solo studies, and there are also 6 practice etudes that have you playing through all 12 bars of the progression unaccompanied. All of the examples are played over the same shuffle backing track in the key of A. But to give you more to practice with, I've created 72 versions of this same backing track, meaning there are versions in all 12 keys at 3 different tempos and with 2 different band arrangements. One that's just bass and drums so that you can slot in and complete a traditional blues trio setup, and another arrangement that incorporates some keyboard parts as well. I truly believe that this book is some of my best work to date. It was an absolute joy getting to put it together. And the best part is we've made this insanely valuable resource available to you at a very affordable price point. So if you're interested in making a quantum leap with your blues improvisation this year, click the link beneath the video to grab your copy today. Thank you for watching.